Let's assume that man-made global warming exists and will have negative effects. The argument is that while humans are not producing many greenhouse gases, the Earth has emerged as a self-regulating system, and releasing stored greenhouse gases into the atmosphere will result in a new equilibrium at a higher temperature. So just a tiny increase will have tiny systematic effects, and let us also assume that these effects are undesirable. The free market boycott solution factors in how much individuals value combating global warming versus economic growth. Individuals interested in combating global warming could and already are forming associations. Now, I understand that few individuals would be willing to reduce their carbon footprint if they were the only ones to do it, which is why collective action would be needed. Perhaps a petition or central register of all people on the planet who cared about global warming. This central register, probably along with other rating agencies and the regresses of watchdogs and all that stuff, would certify if a product was approved or not as planet safe, or carbon neutral or whatever. The register would also be connected to debit/credit cards so that the card would only approve of planet safe products, and joining either the Central Global Warming Registry or one of a network would require the use of one of these cards. If you don't use their card that bars non-approved products, then you don't get to proclaim your environmental virtuousness. People would be motivated to join a global warming registry for the same reason people buy nice-looking clothes: social prestige. And as we know, people are willing to pay a premium for social prestige, coupled with the genuine concern for the planet, of course. As more people join the registry, it goes from being elite to mandatory, not instantaneously, but on a gradient. Now, in Africa, they won't give two shits about global warming for quite some time. But as people become better off, they will value combating global warming more than economic growth, as they gain more of one thing. And so I see a network of registries whose membership grows as economic growth grows and as global warming propaganda spreads. No, I do not use propaganda here in a pejorative fashion, right? To propagate ideas is not necessarily either good or bad by my subjective evaluation. Obviously, growth of the global warming registries drives growth of the registries, right? As it grows, that leads to more. As people join it, that leads to more people joining it. And so that is, as it becomes more likely that they will have some meaningful effect, more people become willing to join. So the three things that will drive the growth of the global warming registries are: 1, growth of the registries, right? Growth drives growth. 2, economic advancement for the world median income. And 3, global warming propaganda and the genuine negative effects of global warming. And the thing that will shrink the registries are: 1, shrinking of the registries, right? Just as growth drives growth, shrinking will drive shrinking. Though I suspect once someone joins one of these registries, a decline in the number of these registries will not cause other people to leave as much as growth of the registries will cause other people to join. But anyway, I do believe, to a lesser extent, shrinking of the registries does drive shrinking of the registries. Another thing that will shrink the registries are the economic decline of the world median income, right? As people become more concerned about food production for the next week, they're going to care less about the planet in general down the line. And 3, anti-global warming propaganda and the positive effects of global warming, if there are positive effects of global warming, or the non-existence of global warming and people becoming convinced that global warming is just a bugaboo or something like that. Those 3 things will shrink the registries. Firms will then either cater to the registry members or non-members. Firms which originally did not meet the registry standards will have to restructure, right, which is never fun, at least part of themselves in order to satisfy the new demands of the registry members, as the new standards are in effect a boycott, right? Though the boycott is not aimed at a specific industry, but at a mode of production. And I'm sure there will be people who are willing to wage war against polluting firms, right? See, eco-terrorism, right? So these registries would in fact be like a large boycott, and there are a few people for whom the boycott is not enough. They want like real change now, and they will wage, and for them it will be the war response, right? That's eco-terrorism, right? And they will be used in anti-global warming propaganda, right? The eco-terrorists will use an anti-global warming propaganda, though I don't predict it will be decisive. These nutters running around, I don't think they'll be decisive. Assuming the global warming science is sound, which I personally don't think it is, then the registries should be effective in reducing greenhouse gases to the extent of their membership. And then once they have enough members, the registries may then field armies to wage a war against all firms that do not comport to their standards, and this may or may not work. It is also possible that global warming is being promoted by the state because it can be used to justify more state intervention. And politicians can, for example, an individual politician can, for example, get ethanol subsidies. It need not be some grand conspiracy. It's just that any individual agent of the state is generally incentivized to support state expansion, and global warming justifies state expansion. For the democratic state, the solution is much less elegant than that of a free market. First off, taxes are so high that people don't have the personal income to form or join these registries. Statist policies stunt economic growth, especially in the third world, which is extremely statist, and barriers to entry mean profit margins are so high that boycotts are ineffective, as elucidated earlier. That's why the registry solution will not work in today's ghastly gaggle of democratic states. So the state solution is increased, quote, regulation, close quote, of factories, cars, tractors, power plants, and anything that emits greenhouse gases, and the state will require by law that these things be phased out. Perhaps the state will seize resources from the population to use to buy and dispose polluting machinery, right? Similar to cash for clunkers, but on a much larger scale. Now, because economic growth is stagnated and taxes are high, the opposition to global warming is much smaller than it would be on a free market, right? Because economic growth is stagnated and taxes, so I wrote that kind of in an odd way. Because economic growth is stagnated and taxes are so high, there are less people who are actively opposed and working against global warming than there would be on a free market. That's what I was trying to say. And so these statist policies are certain to cause a backlash, right? One positive side effect would be that industries would leave the states where these policies were enacted and move to the third world, though this can and probably would be prevented by erecting tariffs, right? And so firms would try to leave the areas that enact a lot of global warming legislation and go to the third world where there is no global warming legislation, but states can prevent this from happening by erecting huge tariffs, right, and not allowing goods that are produced in the third world to enter into, for example, the United States. And remember that the incentive of each state agent is to expand his bureau, and each congressman is to get elected, and each petty bureaucrat is to do as little work as possible. That is, the state is systematically disinterested in the actual effectiveness of combating global warming, similar to how they are systematically disinterested in fighting poverty, educating kids, maintaining effective roads, etc. Now, this can be a good thing in that state programs don't form cartels, right? Because they're disinterested, right? And disinterested means they provide shoddy services because they don't care about profits themselves, because their money doesn't come directly from the customer, but right? But they are not interested in forming cartels to raise profits. Anyway. The global warming registries, however, will be competing for customers and will be systematically interested in actually combating global warming. This is because they are integrated into the structure of production. People are joining the registries voluntarily. So not only would a free market promote economic growth, which would lead to more people supporting the registries, but the registries would, through competition, be directly incentivized to actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions of firms. And they wouldn't be forcing large oppositional population into the arrangement, at least not until they had achieved global supermajority status. And even in the ascent, that is, before they had achieved near global dominance, they would be reducing greenhouse gas emissions all the way up, as opposed to the all-or-nothing nature of state law. I support the free market solution as it would most satisfy subjective valuation, but you cannot have this in isolation. That is, you can't have a free market in solving global warming, but statism everywhere else. The statism everywhere else prevents the free market solution to global warming.